Unfortunately, she had to change plans at short notice, and that is why we're all the more pleased to have her Deputy Director, Hubert Gams. He's Deputy Director General of that commission, and he's an expert because he is the SME coordinator. Welcome to Mr. Gams. I'm not sure whether we can see him. His face has not appeared yet on the screen. I hope he's here anyway. I'll just continue with my round of introduction. Welcome to Wolfgang Renke, who is here as the President of the Chambers of Industry and Commerce of Baden-Württemberg and Vice President of Eurochambers. Welcome. Also, I'd like to welcome Rainer Reichhold, President of the Confederation of Skilled Crafts, Dr. Roman Glaser on my right, President of the Baden-Württemberg Cooperatives Association, and Peter Schneider, the President of the Savings Banks Finance Group, Baden-Württemberg. And last but not least, on the far right, you can see Carmen Rittler, President of the Regional Association of German Banks of Baden-Württemberg. So, a very warm welcome to all of you here. Now, during the next hour or so, we're going to discuss two key questions. How can you ensure that the transformation is as efficient as possible, and the EU single market as the basis for our industry, is it properly prepared for this transformation, and what is it that we can do? And the focus of this discussion will be on the SMEs, the small and mid-sized enterprises. I'm going to look forward to the Minister's input statement. Welcome to all of you here in the room, but also in the live stream. Dear Deputy Director General Hubert Gams, great to have you here. We in Baden-Württemberg are very innovative, very strong industry here in our region. And also we have a lot of small and mid-sized companies. And it really makes us a very attractive location for industry. Let me just give you a couple of figures. Now, the backbone of our industry are the almost 500,000 SMEs, an impressive number. And also, a large portion of the employees come from these companies and also of the training places too. And that is why the SMEs are crucially important during the transformation towards a more sustainable economy. Now, and if we want this to be a success, then we will simply have to focus in everything that we do at the European level on small and mid-sized industry. Now, it's our SMEs, really, who will, of course, implement the transformation locally. So that is why I'm so pleased to have our representative here from the crafts sector or trade sector, thinking of heat pumps, for example. So that will be very important in the future. And that is why we have to take the interests of SMEs more into account at the European level. Now, as the state of Baden-Württemberg, we also are very strongly represented in the field of science. More than 1,000 institutions who do technology transfer, which is the dovetailing of science and industry. So that again has embarked on a very successful path here in Baden-Württemberg. And probably that's one reason why industry in our region is so innovative, and the potential for innovation of SMEs is something that we really need. Now, and dear Director General. Now, some decisions have already been taken, some decisions are being implemented at the moment, and more decisions are in the offing, of course. But what I'd like to talk about is red tape, bureaucracy. Now, what we are anticipating is this huge wave of bureaucracy that, threatens to overwhelm our SMEs. And these entrepreneurs, as a rule, cannot tap into hosts of sustainability managers or, university graduated sustainability experts in order to write hundreds and hundreds of pages, which are currently being demanded by the Commission and which will also be demanded in the future. Now, more red tape also uses up resources, human resources, that is, people who cannot be deployed elsewhere. Or if you talk about the digital work, it's certainly not really sustainable if so much paperwork is being produced and so much reporting is happening. So I believe this could be an impediment to growth. Let me give an example of where the EU policies seem to be a bit contradictory. The small and mid-sized capital market-orientated companies. Now, the Commission wants to improve the access of SMEs to the capital market, and it has now contributed an initiative, or has made this part of their work program for 2022. On the other hand, these capital market-orientated SMEs will be subject and have to meet the full sustainability reporting duties. Now, for us, this seems to be sending out contradictory signals, and SMEs in Baden-Württemberg are very much geared towards exports. The export quota of Baden-Württemberg is 40% of GDP here, and that is why, to a great extent, our SMEs really have to depend on a truly level playing field, a fair competitive environment. So in everything, in all the decisions that you take, that is something you should bear in mind. We talked about taxonomy this morning already, but it also plays an important role regarding the future of SMEs too, especially if you look at some specific sectors. So you must not cut them off from funding sources, because we have to keep an open mind regarding to the technologies that are going to be supported. And that, by the way, is our underlying attitude in Baden-Württemberg. Politicians cannot dictate what are good technologies and what are bad technologies, especially with a view to climate change and that challenge. And therefore, we have this request, really, be pragmatic when it comes to taxonomy and how that's going to be implemented. Make sure it doesn't exclude certain industries. And what I have in mind are in particular suppliers in the automotive sector. Thank you very much, Mr. Gams. Now, you heard what the situation is like in Baden-Württemberg. Now, we're really looking forward to your thoughts on this and what your view of the role is of SMEs.
Thank you very much, and first of all I'd like to say hello to you from Brussels, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this round of discussions. I think the last 2 years have been particularly difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises. In 2020, 1.4 million of jobs were lost in SMEs in the European Union, and the value added of SMEs dropped by 7.6% within the EU. Now, one might say economic recovery is in full swing, but in many industrial ecosystems in all member states, actually, SMEs have not reached their pre-crisis level yet. At the same time, SMEs, of course, play a key role in implementing the industrial policy strategy of the EU. Without the SMEs, we are not going to have the innovative solutions for the challenges we are facing: energy transition, climate transition, and social coherence. And for that reason, we need the SMUs for this double transition towards a more sustainable and towards a more digital economy. And that is also why we in Brussels are fully aware of the fact that special support for the SMEs is required. For example, by reducing red tape when it comes to SMEs, because it is obvious that SMEs do not have the same possibilities as the large players when it comes to reporting or when it comes to legal matters. They do not have the same size of legal departments as big players have. So we realized that special action is required in this regard, and we did take this special action in implementing the SME strategy, which the Commission presented in 2020. And together with the updated industrial policy, we want to provide a boost to the overall economy. When it comes to SMEs, we must make sure that the public sector, public customers do pay in good time, because delayed payments is a special problem in the crisis, especially for SMEs. And in the digital economy, the responsibilities of digital platforms and service providers have to be clearly described, which we do in the Digital Services Act. And then, of course, we also must improve the access of SMEs to capital, which means to capital markets, but also access to financial products in order to support the goals of InvestEU. Disruptions in the supply chain and scarcity of raw material also affect SMEs. And that's why in the European Cluster Platform or in the European Europe Network, we try to support SMEs specifically if they are facing disruptions in the supply chain. How can they find new local cross-border partners? There are also sustainability advisors, the new Europe Enterprise Network, advisors which are supposed to go out to the SMEs and to help them in mastering the green transition. And the same also goes for digitization. In this area, we also want to support the SMEs, because SMEs do not yet consider digitization such a big target as we consider it. We think it's essential for all companies, and here we want to promote collaboration between big and small companies. At the same time, we also have the so-called digital innovation hubs, which provide access to SMEs to digital technologies. The recovery resilience facility plays a key role. So there are funds available for digitization, for access to training and technologies. Public sector contracts and awards also play an important here, because the public sector here can also make sure that SMEs are considered appropriately in tenders. Then we also looked at the national plans. So far, 22 national plans have been adopted, and we analyzed them. We realized that about 109 billion euros, which is 24% of all of the funds, can be used by SMEs. Now, this is a declaration of intent of the member states, and now also together with you in the regions and the countries, we have to make sure that these funds, this support actually also reaches the small and medium-sized enterprises. You also mentioned the obligation of due diligence and due care within the supply chains. And of course, here it is important for companies to commit themselves to complying with human rights and other specific rights in their sourcing countries. And the objectives that we're pursuing is to prevent the fragmentation of the internal market. And that's very important also for the export-based companies in Baden-Württemberg. So we want really to generate a common framework, a level playing field. Coherence with various other legal regulations is also something we consider very important, and we understand that this is extremely important for SMEs. We want to promote a level playing field also when it comes to third-party countries, because we don't want third-party companies to simply be able to avoid the rules which apply to EU companies. And we also realize that the capabilities and specific needs of companies in meeting their obligation of care and diligence must also, of course, be tailored to the size of company. And you cannot ask an SME to meet the same reporting obligations as a big company. Madam Minister, you also touched upon the EU taxonomy. I think a transparent classification system for sustainable and green investment, that's the overall target that we are all committed to. However, of course, this must not go to the detriment of the SMEs. who are already facing difficulties in accessing financial resources in the first places. And for that reason, in our delegated act, we also stipulated that the requirements of non-financial reporting must not lead to a disproportionate burden onto the SMEs, and that's why the SMEs were exempted from the reporting obligation of the banks. Now, we all agree that SMEs play an essential role in the implementation of the transformation, and for that reason, we have to take their special needs and requirements into account. We do so, we try so. Maybe we're not always at an optimum, but we're working hard on it. Reducing the red tape, of course, applies to the EU level, but it also applies to national levels and also regional and state levels. So I think we are all here facing the same challenge. All together, we have to try to reduce the burdens on SMEs and to keep them as low as possible. And I'm looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you, Mr. Gams. And we heard that there is a good deal of understanding of what is happening in this regard. But I'm looking at Mr. Grenke. You, of course, know Baden-Württemberg industry. So where's there a need for action?
Well, basically, the Green Deal is supposed to help us reach carbon neutrality by 2050. There's no question about this. We want to achieve this all together. But for SMEs, this must also be affordable from an economic point of view, and there are major differences, and that's what we have to keep a close eye on. Just take the reporting and disclosure obligations which SMEs are facing, and that's something which which must not be implemented in the way that has been communicated so far. Here, we really do have to make a clear distinction according to the size of companies. Let me also briefly touch upon the Supply Chain Act, which is to be passed on a European level, because this will add further reporting duties. Now, one big problem is that small companies and SMEs are exempted from this, but of course the big companies will have to impose similar obligations onto their sub-suppliers, and this means that SMEs will indirectly be affected nevertheless, and that's something to be avoided.
Thank you, Mr. Reichhold.
Man hört es ja von allen Ecken, ja, Handwerker sind gefragt und nicht
people
immer da,
hear
wenn
it,
man sie
we
braucht. Also
need other crafts, but there's a scarcity of it too at the moment. So
es gibt wohl, glaube ich, auch ein paar Schattenseiten. Oder
you need them, but they're not available. So not everything is light. There's also a good deal of shade, right?
Now, first of all, I'm glad that you have such a positive view of the trades, and I can tell you, whenever you need a craftsman, he'll also be there. Now, let me also tell you that the trades as a whole, well, they're not all well off. Parts of the trades are really doing well, but we also have other areas and segments of the trades which are still suffering massively from COVID-19. So that's everything which is related to events and services. Now, the question is, how do the trades deal with regulations? Well, we are being flooded by the red tape. And a typical crafts shop has got 3 to 5 employees. They certainly do not have a legal department, and all of the regulations have to be handled by the owner of that small company, and that's simply too much. And what is going to come in the future is going to add an additional burden to craftsmen. And therefore, I can only subscribe to what has been said before. We must make it possible for companies to handle all of these requirements. The SMEs, they do not even understand anymore what they need to do. The big companies, they're able to deal with all of these burdens, but they pass on part of it to their supply chain. Bankings have to classify their corporate customers by reaching out to them and asking for data from them. And of course, so once again, the SMEs are affected. Now, the overall goal and the overall target might be right, but the impact onto companies, for example, in Baden-Württemberg, we've got 130,000 crafts shops. They cannot handle these requirements anymore. The question: are you able to call a craftsman when you need it? Well, yes, we do, if we work hard on it. I mean, the trades, of course, are strong supporters of the energy transition. And I grew up in a craft shop myself, in the shop of my grandfather, and at that time it was obvious that the products he sold, he also repaired them. So products at that time had a much longer service life. And it's interesting now that we see a renaissance of the idea of repairing things that have once been sold, and the trades are available for that. But for that purpose, first of all, products must be manufactured in a manner that allows them to repair on the other hand. Our minister already mentioned the topic of heat pumps as one element of the energy transition. Now, somebody has to install heat pumps, and they also need to be maintained. And the heat pump is only one part to be installed in existing buildings, and here we have a lot of potential to save energy in the existing buildings, and for that purpose we need qualified, skilled workers, but we do not have enough of them, and therefore we certainly need immigration. We need people from the European space, but beyond that we also need qualified staff from non-European countries. Well, I think we will get the job done if we've got enough time, and this means if regulations have been tailored to such a manner that companies can still comply with them, that companies are able to adjust their policies correspondingly and are able to properly qualify their staff. And of course, there's always a downside to everything. I already mentioned regulations. Nevertheless, I'm quite confident. I think we can do the job, but we can only do the job if politics also takes the needs of these many small craft shops into account, but we also have many small other suppliers. We've got more than just Bosch and Daimler and Porsche, and I think altogether we can still do the job. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Reichhold. Now, Dr. Glaser, we heard about the challenges to the craftsmen. Now, you represent almost 800 corporates in Baden-Württemberg. Now, what about them? What about commercial enterprises and the finance industry? What are the challenges?
Now, indeed, our association has got 50 industries. We've got 140 cooperative banks, we've got 340 corporations in the agricultural area, and we've got members cooperatives in all the areas such as the trades, energy, services, and retail. And therefore we believe that SMEs and the banking industry are pursuing the same goals, because both of them will be affected if we have additional regulations. And the risk or the dangerous thing about regulations is that there's a good justification for every single action, every single requirement, but if it becomes too much, then we're losing transparency. However, this kind of a symbiosis between the real economy and mid-sized banks, I mean, this symbiosis is very, very essential. And here we've got the specific feature of the German mid-sized savings banks. But if that symbiosis does not work properly, then a transformation will also be difficult. And what we need for this transformation is reliable credit funding. And in order to be able to offer these respective credits, we need also a general framework which takes the size and the risk appetite of the individual customers and clients into account. And small, low-risk banks do not have the status within the EU which they deserve. I mean, the threefold banking system which makes Germany and especially Baden-Württemberg very strong has not given the kind of appreciation which it deserves. And that's something we'll have to discuss once again when we talk about the targets of the Green Deal, which we fully support, but we also have the consequences of this Green Deal and digital transformation into account. Because if the ecological, social and economic sustainability criteria are not met together, then the overall process will be hindered. And therefore we have to make sure that the regulations can be handled by SMEs and by clients rather than slowing them down, because otherwise we run the risk of not reaching our targets. And this would affect especially Baden-Württemberg with its strong SME backbone. And for that reason, thanks to your initiative, Madam Minister, we have joined all our forces in promoting our interests.
Herr Schneider, Herr Glaser hat schon einige Dinge aus der Finanzwirtschaft angesprochen.
Mr. Glaser mentioned a couple of points from finance industry. Question to you, Mr. Schneider. Now, the savings banks, of course, provide financing. What are the remaining challenges?
Now, in addition to what my colleague said, let me add that 100 billion of additional investments are required in Germany alone. To put this into context, now who is supposed to provide that funding? I mean, SMUs cannot find access to such huge funds. It has just been said. The requirements are getting stricter and stricter also in terms of lending, Madam Minister, and I think we should make sure that we still have a strong regional banking sector supporting the regional SMEs. And that's inevitable, and here we've got the big trends that have been touched upon. I mean, regulation is hitting the banks at an unprecedented scale. It's unbelievable, the things that we deal with. Then, of course, the big requirement is to have more and more equity. I don't understand why. Take Basel III and everything. Capital and equity requirements are increasing more and more, although we've got the lowest risks in years and decades, and we're still going through one of the biggest crises after World War II. And on an average, companies have dealt with that crisis very well. Of course, at different magnitude, but we did not see any increase in risk costs. And there's no reason. And there's no reason why we have that total trend for more and more equity requirements, but of course which makes it more and more difficult for companies to raise that equity. Now let's just take the sequence of events. On 9th of December 2021, the taxonomy was published by the EU in their Gazette, and it already applies as of January 1st. Of course, it's going to be introduced step by step, but still, now we've got the delegated acts that you have mentioned. I mean, just the timeline already shows that this is simply not doable. And reality is just a different one. You're quite right in saying, which I absolutely welcome, that you say that SMEs are exempted from reporting duties, no more red tape, but in reality things look different. And of course banks are already steering according to the green asset ratio in risk monitoring, and also in credit awarding we have to take the ESG risks into account. So reality is moving into an entirely different direction. So I think we'd be well advised to enter into a specific dialogue about the specific situations on site. We discussed this with Mr. Harger this morning, and I also would like to have the same discussions with you in order to name the specific things which are happening on site.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. I believe, Mrs. Mittler, you represent private banks. I'm sure you can round out the picture. Of course, I'll do that with pleasure. And the preceding speakers have anticipated quite a few things I wanted to say, but let me actually fill in this discussion with some figures. If you think of the European capital market and companies need capital to fund transformation, we can expect that for the transformation 350 billion euros will be required each year. And if you look at the digital transformation, that will be another 125 billion that is needed. So enormous sums. Now, looking at that, it's clear you need private capital, but as I see it, it's also important that the banks are roped into, all types of banks, in this effort. And that is why I believe, climate change can only be done together with the banks, involve them, make sure that they're accountable too. And we heard it's not just about green. Between green and brown, there are a lot of other shades, in-between shades, for which funding is required too. So we have to think about how this can be handled, because you cannot just provide funding for green companies. You also have to support companies who come from much dirtier industrial backgrounds. And it's important that you don't put too many stumbling blocks in the roads of banks, nor for companies. And as I said before, if you look at the European universal banking system, this is really the pillar supporting, underpinning European industry. And it's also a prerequisite for efficient financing requirements for companies of all sizes. I believe that's important. If you look at it, you need different kinds of loans. I totally agree with you. Now, the capital market is probably not the right choice for any company out there, but we need bilateral loans, of course, of banks, but also support banks too. And if you think back to May or June, we've seen it, how well the cooperation worked with the intermediary institutions too. So I believe all the three things are so important for different kinds of companies. And that is why we welcome the green loan standard, but also the other topics that have been addressed here. Taxonomy must not be overcomplicated, too bureaucratic. Thank you very much for adding these points. Now we've seen the current situation and the challenges that the different industries are up against. Mrs. Hoffmeister-Kraut, where do you see the link to the European level? And what is it that the EU should do more of in order to successfully address these challenges? Now that is why I'm so pleased, Mr. Gums, that you are available for this discussion today and that you can answer some of our questions. Now, it's not just been made very clear from the financial industry, but also from, well, industry at large, that we need to have regulation with a sense of proportion. And let me also mention the European Supply Chain Act. I'm sure, of course, you're very aware of that. And you will also be aware of the SMEs, of course, and how they actually play into it. But we have to make sure that we will find rules which work in the long run, which will prevent fragmentation or a lot of individual national approaches, because we do need a single market that's strong. And if I think of the Posted Worker Directive, even though that's not at the center of our discussion today, Mr. Gums, it was truly counterproductive. If you look at the purposes for which it was designed, it didn't meet these purposes. And that is why we need a due diligence obligation or duty. And we have launched such an initiative in Baden-Württemberg, Global Responsible Baden-Württemberg it's called. And especially our small and mid-sized companies assume a lot of responsibility for sustainable management of supply chains. And we also have a German Supply Chain Act. And that is why our request is, please don't go beyond what we already have there in this regard. And what I have in mind here in this regard is civil liability, which would have massive consequences for the managing directors of companies in particular. After all, some situations, of course, can only be, handled and held to a limited extent, but they would be exposed to this risk. So that is one big challenge. And there's also a large wave of successors that will be needed for companies. So it will be the intergenerational handover of companies. So given that, it wouldn't be helpful if we undermine this. People need to enjoy being entrepreneurs, and that is why the risk at least has to be controllable. And there's another important topic, and I briefly mentioned it before, taxonomy and sustainability reporting. And Mr. Glaser and Mr. Schneider also explained this very clearly. And just by way of example, I'd like to talk about mechanical engineering. We have a lot of specialty machine manufacturers in Baden-Württemberg who produce single machines, special designs. Now, and as part of the taxonomy, there are life cycle analyses that are demanded and also comparative analyses. But that cannot really be done, really. So a company that cannot answer these KPIs, will their access to the financing market be barred? Where will they get the capital from in order to fund restructuring, especially for automotive suppliers too? What must not happen is that, and let me stress this again, that some sectors of industry are cut off from financing sources. So we do need a regulatory framework which will make it possible for our SMEs to fully tap their innovative potential. If that is the case, a lot of startups which are highly active in Baden-Württemberg, to profit from that. Less red tape will also really foster more startups, more founding, more companies being founded. And that is why we have to make sure we avoid the domino effect, which Mr. Grenke mentioned, that the big ones demand from their suppliers, a lot of which are SMEs, to fulfill all of these obligations, even if it's not in the first step, then during the second step. So this is important when it comes to taxonomy, but I'm not quite sure whether you're aware of it, really. It also applies to REACH. Many companies have come to us who have grave doubts with regard to this, especially the handling of individual substances, the textile industry, but of course also the chemical industry in particular. They are saying that, whole steps of the value add chain are simply no longer there. So they will have to source things, outside of the country. They can't produce them anymore at home. So that should not happen. So that is why we demand simplification of rules, but not only that, as Mr. Schneider said too, the taxonomy, was implemented very quickly, introduced very quickly, but we need to be given transition periods so that companies can really get prepared for changes like these. Let me mention the Medicinal Products Directive. This is still a big challenge, especially with regards to certification, simply because the requirements weren't in place for companies to get certified. The criteria were defined far too late, and there is still a lot of bottlenecks. There's still a lot of backlog when it comes to the certified bodies. So the institutions who actually do the certification. So we need a fair and differentiated view of things, and that is why it's such a concern of ours that the many small and mid-sized companies we have here, as I said, it's 500,000 in Baden-Württemberg, that they get better support from this European Union, because they are such an indispensable player which will strengthen our single market in the future too. They have their roots here, but they are global companies, very much geared towards exports nevertheless. So we rely on the SMEs, and they need to be given good future prospects. Thank you very much, Mr. Gums. Now, I've seen it. You've been busy taking notes here as you listened of all these challenges and opportunities that were discussed. Now, we're looking forward to how you respond. What is it that the EU is doing? How does it give support? How can it help to better support competitiveness of companies in Baden-Württemberg?
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the input. Now, that's really a long wish list, all pointing actually into the same direction, namely not to overburden the SMEs. And that was also touched upon several times. Mr. Glaser said so, that there's lots of different regulations which individually all make sense, but taken together that's a huge burden. And of course we try to limit this on a European level. Whether we always succeed to the sufficient extent, well, I've got my doubts about this listening to this discussion right now. Nevertheless, we've got to really work hard to reconcile the ecological targets with the social requirements, while at the same time maintaining and strengthening the competitiveness of companies in general and SMEs in particular. Credit funding will certainly also remain important in the future as well. And for that reason, I listen very closely what the various representatives of the banking industry said, of cooperative banks and private banks and save-it banks. I think we really have to make sure that we bring all of these aspects together. Of course, we have to try to make sure that in the area of funding, we also ensure that this kind of funding contributes to the success of the Green Deal. I think that's indispensable. That's an essential element to make sure that this target can also be reached, a target which you're all committed to. We all agree that we have to fight climate change, that the harmful emissions are reduced, and of course for that reason our economy, production, the services sector have to become greener as well. And of course, for that purpose, we have to use all of the tools available, including access to the capital markets. But at the same time, we have to make sure that the SMEs can also play a role in this. We must not kind of rule them out. Or Mr. Reichert talked about the aspects of repairing. I mean, these days, you buy things, use them over one life cycle, and as soon as they're broken, they're getting discarded. I mean, that's not possible in the future anymore, but this also requires certain rules and regulations. For example, a requirement saying that products have to be designed and manufactured in such a manner that they can also be repaired. So we will need this kind of a regulation on the European level. But, I mean, it's not just us here in Brussels alone, but it's also the member states with their representatives in the European Parliament. And all together we have to try to devise rules and regulations which take the specific characteristics in the individual countries into account. The taxonomy and the timeline of the taxonomy, I mean, the fact that it takes more time, that's something I take note of. Rest assured, we are aware of that. I mean, we do not simply communicate rules just before they get implemented. Of course, it's important to give companies the time to adjust to it. I mean, planning certainty is absolutely required so that everybody knows what they will be facing in the future, and companies must be given the necessary time and support to adjust to such new rules. And that's why I specifically mentioned that there are respective development programs, the involvement of the development banks, for example. That's also one key path for channeling EU funds to the respective companies. I mean, it's not a direct awarding of funds from Brussels to companies. Here we are rather using development banks or the banking sector in general to launch products and facilities specifically geared towards the needs of the SMEs. And of course, when it comes to applying the rules, we also have to apply a sense of proportion. The application or the enforcement actually of rules and regulations usually takes place on the level of the member states or on the level of the individual states within the member states. So here, once again, we are facing the same task and requirements. We always have to apply a sense of proportion. Of course, rules have to be enforced. This also applies to the single market. And of course, companies here also suffer from the fact that not everybody applies the rules in the same manner, which leads to a distortion of competition, which is something we cannot accept and tolerate either. Whenever we devise new rules and regulations, we have to take the aspects of the SMEs into account as well. On the one hand, this works by granting exemptions to SMEs, but here we have to take the example of the Supply Chain Act into account, where SMEs might still get affected through the back door. And of course, in German law, there's also a requirement specifying that suppliers also have to meet certain reporting obligations. And if this affects SMEs, then we have to see how we can support them. For example, by saying that if SMEs are asked to report to their major companies or to the OEMs, then one has to ask these OEMs to make sure that in general their suppliers and sub-suppliers meet certain requirements, but they do not have to provide all of the details. So we have to appreciate and recognize that if SMEs have undertaken certain action in terms of reporting, that this will also be accepted in a legal sense. So enforcement, as I said, of the rules is very important, and here we really have to make sure that we properly and efficiently enforce the rules. So once again, it's important about striking the right balance. Rules are only justified if they can also be enforced. And very often, this is the task of the authorities. But at the same time, we have to make sure in the first place that we devise rules which can also be controlled and verified and properly enforced. And this is not just a thing for us here in Brussels. The question is, how can enforcement also be ensured on site or on a local basis? Please rest assured that whenever we as the Commission devise proposals, we always also ask ourselves, what does this mean to SMEs? And very often there are special rules and exemptions for SMEs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gams. Well, I'm sure people will want to explore these questions further, so let me open the next round here. Mr. Grenke, perhaps you'd like to start first. So I'm not quite sure whether we have time for all of you to make a statement, perhaps just the key things. Let's look at the EU and the single market and competitiveness. From your point of view, what is it that is needed in order to ensure competitiveness in the future?
Well, we do have a European single market. I mean, that's a fact. That's reality. Of course, there's always things that can be done better, and there's also gradually an EU labor market emerging. But one thing where we have not really in advance yet is a kind of European educational market. And here I'm thinking especially of the chambers of commerce and chambers of crafts. And here I'm thinking of vocational training. And here we have different kind of structures in the various countries, which also leads to a divergence of developments in various countries. And this is something which also has got its impact onto transformation as a whole. So this kind of European education program, a pan-European education program is required.
It's a very important point. Mr. Reichhold, would you like to share a thought regarding this with us?
Well, I'd like to come back to the situation between Germany and France. We've got a long common border along the Rhine River, and Madam Minister visited the Alsatian region last fall together with a delegation from the trades, and we noticed very clearly that we were not making any progress in cross-border business, but we're rather even seeing a deterioration. We used to see improvements in cross-border collaboration. Companies sent their staff across the border to complete orders there, and we also have seen trainees on an international scale. But all of this has been reversed, and we have now a situation which is worse than 15 years ago. And this is not really what we as citizens consider pan-European collaboration. I mean, the reasons for this are very, very well known. It is mainly, the reasons mainly lay in kind of nationalist seclusion or separation, and that makes our lives very hard, and this applies to the relationship between Baden-Württemberg and Switzerland, for example, although it's not an EU country.
Thank you, Mr. Glass. I'm sure you've got more messages to share with us from the cooperatives' point of view.
Well, there are three aspects I'd like to come back to which have been mentioned: market, education, and collaboration. Now, if I had taken notes, then probably bureaucracy, regulation, regulators would have been mentioned very, very often today, and the word market probably was used only very rarely. And if you look at the structures, EU, the member states, and then the regions, and if we more think in terms of the market, whereas regulation is only considered a tool to support that market, well, then we would really strengthen those elements which also boosted our economy, namely market mechanisms. So this is already important when we look at the language we're using. In discussion, we have been talking about rules and regulations all the time. Secondly, I'm very grateful to Mr. Grenke to have emphasized the importance of education. And here, I think the equivalence of academic and vocational training is very important. I mean, outside of the EU, I think my colleagues can confirm that, outside the EU we're often getting questions about the so-called dual approach or dual path training, which we have, theoretical and practical and vocational training. From outside the EU, we're getting these questions, but inside the EU, we're not getting this kind of unity. And then, of course, collaboration. More than ever before, SMEs are dependent on collaboration. Now, this can come through cooperatives or not, but still, giving the concept of collaboration more attention also will allow SMEs to benefit. Madam Minister, I'm grateful for you and your ministry to support a study on SMEs can better use data also through alliances, and certainly here also more collaboration is required for better access to the markets.
Thank you, Mrs. Mittler. This time, not the last person to speak here. Do you have any messages to share with us regarding private banks? No, I just mulled it over mentally. Baden-Württemberg really is the region of thinkers and tinkers, where a lot of inventions were made. And I believe this stands in stark contrast to all the regulation that seems to be required and the demands there are. And I believe the more freedom there is, the more there is freedom to invent. And I believe that is something we need. And the second thing I'd like to address is the labor market, because the labor market is getting ever more competitive. And you cannot just source people from your vicinity, but you also need to look abroad. But this takes simple rules. So I believe it's something that needs to be double-checked. What kind of rules are really necessary and how they can be simplified in order to to have a more liberal labour market from a European point of view. And Mr. Schneider, a very brief statement because we haven't got much time. So perhaps you could talk briefly and share a message with Mr. Gams.
Well, you still have to be able to take everything into account. And here you really have to take the perspective of the people in the street into account and the SMEs. And if you do so, then you will see and understand that they cannot deal with the complexity of requirements anymore. And then last but not least, acceptance. I mean, you need the buy-in from everybody, from the people. In our banks, fortunately, we've got lots of people clients who say we want to put our money in green assets, something sustainable. So that's good, that's positive. People want to promote the green transition. But now look at the MiFID II process. How much consultation requirements and informed consent requirements have to be met. I mean, we have to ask a lot of questions. How sustainable, and everything has to be documented. So it's a long questionnaire clients have to answer. And then at the end of the day, they're going to leave the bank and will say, leave me alone with that green stuff. So we have to keep things simple in order to get people's buy-in. That's my simple request.
Thank you, Mr. Gams. We heard it. Many demands have been formulated. People talked about red tape bureaucracy, but also about education and acceptance. Now, first we'd like to hear how you respond to all of this, and perhaps you would like to formulate some wishes to industry in Baden-Württemberg.
Well, thanks a lot. First of all, I'm very glad that education within Europe has also been mentioned as well, because that's something that we certainly need, a European education program. And we're dealing with that. The so-called dual approach training indeed is an example which we also try to promote in other member states of the European Union, especially in countries where we've got high juvenile employment. And we want them to learn from Germany to a certain extent. Of course, that takes its time. But I think in Brussels, the so-called dual type of training is well respected. Now, this so-called European education program, a European education space, can only be achieved if all member states move into the same direction. Because education, rightly so, is the responsibility of the member states, and we, the European Union, we want to promote and support the member states in advancing their educational systems and programs. And of course, here we have to further motivate the member countries. Then Germany, France was mentioned. Deterioration of the situation of freedom of movement of goods and services. Now, I've noticed this myself several times in the last few years. I mean, we've got lots of complaints claiming that things have rather worsened, not only between Germany and France, cross-border business, but also in other regions. There are also other member countries complaining about Germany, so it goes in all directions. But of course, this is something which we have to definitely remedy in the internal market. I mean, the single market will never be 100% complete. There's always ways where you can get better, and the Commission is working on this. And the Commission needs, and that's also very important to notice, the Commission needs your support to tell us where do we have problems, specific examples. Then we can go up to other member countries and tell them, now there's something wrong here. That's not compatible with the EU law. Of course, it was said before, we need enforcement of the rules of the single market and collaboration. I mean, that's something we also want to achieve in the single market. Collaboration between countries, especially SMEs, is absolutely necessary in order to open up new possibilities and opportunities. And here we also want to provide support. Now, one last thing, inventions and intellectual property has been mentioned. And here we also think that we've got to make things easier, especially for SMEs, if they've got an invention, to also protect it and use it. There are so-called vouchers, for example, for consultancy for SMEs. So that the consulting services they receive to protect their inventions. Now these consultants, these services will be paid by the EU. So very, very often it's a joint effort that is required. Of course, things coming from Brussels sometimes are complicated, but in many cases they're also made even more difficult by the other levels within the EU. So my request on the member states is, if there are rules coming from the EU which are not 100% correct, then you just improve them, but don't make them even more complicated. So I think that's something we all owe to our companies and especially our SMEs. And my request to the Baden-Württemberg companies would be to keep on going, keep on acting as the driving force for the European company. Keep up your innovativeness, and please always tell us where we can get better to support you. For this very reason, I mean, many things have been touched upon where Brussels can get better, and I will really take this as my homework, and we will try to work on this.
Okay, so we will continue in this vein. Well, thank you, Mr. Gams. It's of course the purpose of our economic summit that those things which are important for us at this time, I mean, all the good things, of course, haven't really been mentioned so much, but of course, now that we talk to you and that we have this exchange, has the point of making you aware of what's happening here in Baden-Württemberg, but the same applies to other industrial regions, of course, in Europe. So you're hearing here about the concerns for industry and also barriers and so on. But that is something that we don't really need at the moment. What we need is a new kind of spirit to see opportunities more than the threat, perhaps. But for this, you need financial leeway, of course. You need funding and support programs. And what people like to say is, you know, application processes are very complex. So when it comes to SMEs, just please make sure that these can be designed more simply. Wouldn't it be possible to do like a kind of systematic SME check for all the programs that are launched? Not just programs, but also decisions. Say that policymakers have to take and bear SMEs, well, at the back of their minds all the time. When it comes to the Posted Workers Directive, I believe at the European level, there should have been a requirement that this should have been limited to just a few vulnerable industries, for example. Or, I mean, really, the social standards are so high in Baden-Württemberg. It would have merited that some regions like this one could have been exempted from this. So simply to take a more pragmatic road when it comes to implementation, which would avoid more red tape. And the last thing I'd like to share with you, just to make sure you've heard it. Now, we have a very strong automotive industry here, and the manufacturers, the OEMs, but also suppliers are now in the middle of this transformation process. Now, as a region that is strong on industry, and we don't really have structural weaknesses, we are not allowed to support individual companies. At the moment, however, we realize there is a need to do this. We have an innovation support program, BW Invest it's called, and there's also a project on artificial intelligence, an innovation park for artificial intelligence, which we help fund, which can be supported. Now, the Minister-President and myself will already turn to the EU with the request that in sectors of industry that are really in the depth of this transformation process, that we can at least support them, but the same should also be applied to small and mid-sized companies. So I believe the state aid framework should be adapted in this regard, improved. And our request to you is, and you are the voice of SMEs, of course, you are the advocate of SMEs vis-à-vis the other departments, and you contribute all of these important aspects to the discussion to really speak with a very strong and loud voice. And I'm sure we shared a lot of very strong arguments today with you in order to really make their and your voice heard when it comes to the decisions that are being taken. Now, thank you very much to you, and please convey my best wishes to Mrs. Jorna. All the best to you. We'll always be available for you for questions, or if you need more examples, we can supply them. All the best to you, Mr. Gams, again. Thank you, Mr. Gams, and thank you to you, Ms. Hoffmeister-Kraut, and thanks to all of you, our panelists. And I'd also like to express my thanks to you, the viewers, for switching on, for joining our summit. Now, I mentioned before, the Economic Summit, of course, comprises these streams, but there are also a lot of background talks that go on behind the scenes, and there was a press conference too. But thank you to all of you, and you, but there's no applause this time round, anyway.